What happens when a giant of comedy, a man whose name defines an entire era of entertainment, walks onto a morning show set, only to be blindsided by a host with an agenda sharper than the studio lights? The moment Eddie Murphy stepped onto the view stage, something shifted. The energy buzzed, the audience leaned forward, and an invisible tension curled through the air. No one, not even Eddie himself, could have predicted the clash that was about to erupt between him and Joy Behar. This wasn't just an interview going off script. It was a stark reminder of how quickly a simple conversation can explode when professional respect slips away. But stay with me, because what unfolded next is something you'll want to dissect piece by piece. Eddie entered the studio with the effortless charm he's carried for over 40 years. That signature smile, that easy stride, the polished confidence of someone who has mastered his craft. It all lit up the room. Whoopi Goldberg, Sarah Haynes, and the rest of the panel welcomed him with genuine enthusiasm, their excitement unmistakable. "We've been waiting for this all week," Whoopi said with a grin. Yet beneath the warm greetings, another kind of anticipation was brewing. One Eddie was about to confront head-on. The conversation opened like a masterclass in chemistry. Eddie's humor, his passion, his behind-the-scenes stories, all of it drew the hosts and the audience in effortlessly. His charisma filled every corner of the studio as he spoke about filmmaking, his cast, his crew, and the enduring magic of storytelling. "After all these years," he said, eyes glimmering under the lights, "I still feel that spark. Creating something that lets people escape for a moment. That's the joy." Sarah nodded, and her admiration genuine. "That integrity shows in everything you do," she told him. Eddie smiled. "Comedy," he said, "is universal. People need to laugh. If I can give them that, I've done my job." And just when everything felt perfectly in sync, everything changed. Without warning, Joy Behar leaned forward. Her expression tightened, her tone shifting from casual to razor-sharp in an instant. "Speaking of comedy, Eddie," she said, cutting into the warmth like a cold blade, "don't you think some of your older material is considered problematic by today's standards?" The temperature in the room dropped. Hard. Eddie didn't lose his smile, but it tightened, just enough for the cameras to catch it. The other hosts exchanged uneasy glances. Joy had steered the show into turbulent waters, and everyone knew it. "I'm not sure what you mean," Eddie replied calmly, maintaining control even as the ground beneath him shifted. But Joy doubled down, her tone edging toward confrontation. "Your old stand-up bits, the ones people call offensive now, don't you think your audience deserves an apology?" "Joy." Whoopi stepped in, trying to gently redirect. "Maybe we can talk about his new film." But the spark had already hit the powder. "This is an important topic," Joy insisted, her voice rising with conviction. "In an era of accountability, shouldn't public figures address their past?" The air tightened around the table. Eddie's posture straightened, his demeanor transforming from easygoing guest to a seasoned artist defending decades of work. "Let me be very clear," he said evenly. "I've been in comedy for over 40 years. The job is to push boundaries." "At whose expense?" Joy shot back. "Those boundaries left a mark on people." Now the clash was unavoidable. "Comedy reflects the world we live in," Eddie replied, his tone calm but firm. "If we start rewriting every piece of art to match shifting opinions, where does it end?" Joy leaned back, a hint of triumph flickering across her face. "So you're saying you have no regrets?" Eddie met her gaze without hesitation. "I stand by my body of work. I've grown, like everyone does. But I won't apologize for being part of comedy's evolution." The studio atmosphere grew so heavy it felt almost tangible, thick, charged, and on the verge of snapping. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether they were watching an interview or witnessing a public trial unfold in real time. The other hosts looked helpless, their expressions silently pleading for the moment to diffuse. Joy leaned in, her voice dripping with sarcasm as she said, "That's a pretty convenient way to dodge responsibility." The contempt was unmistakable. Eddie's jaw tightened. "Convenient?" he echoed. "You think it's convenient to be blindsided on live television? To have decades of my work boxed into a narrative you decided on before I walked out here?" Joy puffed up, trying to hold her ground. "I'm asking the tough questions," she insisted. But it sounded less like righteous journalism and more like someone who didn't expect pushback. Eddie's tone dropped into a deeper command, and instantly the balance of power shifted. "No," he said, steady and unflinching. "You're throwing accusations, and I'm curious. Do you apply this retroactive standard to every comedian? Or only the one sitting in this chair today?" The panel went rigid. Nobody dared interrupt. Eddie wasn't finished. He turned and fixed Joy with a pointed stare. "Let me ask you something, Joy. In your long career, have you ever said anything someone might find offensive? Ever told a joke that didn't age well? Because if we're cracking open the books for a public review, then every chapter gets read. Don't you agree?" A flush of red climbed Joy's face as Eddie flipped her own tactic back on her with startling precision. Her confidence faltered, replaced by the cornered frustration of someone unprepared for a counterstrike. "That's completely different," she stammered, scrambling for footing. "My work has never been the kind of material you've produced." Eddie raised one eyebrow, unimpressed. "Is that so? You've never joked about how someone looks, or where they're from, or what they believe? Not even once?" The silence that followed answered for her. Sensing the temperature rising to dangerous levels, Whoopi stepped in, desperate to slow the runaway momentum. "Maybe we should all pause and remember we're on the same team here." But Eddie was past the point of restraint. Joy's one-sided standard, demanding accountability from him while excusing herself, had struck a nerve he wasn't willing to ignore. "No, Whoopi," he said, eyes still locked on Joy. "This is exactly the conversation we need. Because what we're seeing right now is the perfect example of the double standard choking real dialogue." Joy scoffed loudly. "Double standards? Eddie, now you're being theatrical." Eddie let out a sharp laugh, cold, humorless. "Theatrical? You staged a live confrontation, framed me as the villain, and now I'm dramatic for pointing out your contradictions?" The audience didn't dare breathe. It no longer felt like daytime TV. It felt like a closed-door meeting accidentally broadcast to millions. A raw, unfiltered clash of two powerful personalities who refused to back down. Joy shook her head insistently. "I wasn't ambushing you. I was asking valid questions about accountability and entertainment." But her defensive tone betrayed the truth. She knew exactly how pointed her approach had been. Eddie leaned forward, voice steady but simmering. "Valid questions don't come wrapped in accusations. You walked onto this set ready to cast me as a villain before the cameras even rolled. And now you want to pretend it's some noble journalistic mission?" Sarah Haynes made one last attempt to steer the wreckage toward calmer waters. "I think what we're trying to understand," she said gently, "is how an artist can evolve while still respecting their earlier work." Eddie acknowledged her with a nod. "Exactly. Growth doesn't mean burning your past to the ground. It means learning from it and moving forward honestly." But Joy wasn't finished, not even close. Joy leaned forward, her tone sharpened to a point. "Authenticity isn't a free pass, Eddie. Words can still wound, and public figures should answer for the damage they create." That was the moment Eddie's composure began to crack, not into anger, but into disbelief. "And there it is," he said quietly, frustration mixing with disappointment. "The assumption that comedy exists to harm. Joy, do you truly understand what comedy is? Its purpose? Its role in society?" Joy straightened, finding renewed confidence in familiar talking points. I understand that comedy can isolate people and reinforce harmful stereotypes, she replied firmly. Eddie didn't flinch. Comedy can do harm, yes, but it can also dissect the powerful like a scalpel, amplify truth like a megaphone, and offer relief when the world feels unbearably heavy. It's not one-dimensional, but I guess that version doesn't fit the tidy little box you've placed me in, does it? The other hosts traded worried glances, silently begging for a lifeline as the tension escalated. After watching the back-and-forth spiral toward open warfare, Whoopi finally stepped in. "All right, both of you," she said with unmistakable authority. "We're professionals. We should be able to disagree without tearing each other down." Sarah immediately echoed her. There has to be room for multiple perspectives here. But Joy couldn't resist one final jab. "I just believe that when your platform is as large as yours, you have a responsibility to use it carefully." That single statement, softly delivered but heavy with implication, set off the explosion that had been brewing. "A responsibility to who, Joy?" Eddie fired back, his patience finally exhausted. "To you? To some invisible committee that decides what's acceptable this week? Or to the millions who've supported my work for decades?" Joy lifted her chin. "To society," she declared with absolute certainty. Eddie stared at her, stunned. "Society? You think you speak for society? You think your personal checklist of what's acceptable represents hundreds of millions of people?" "I believe I speak for anyone who values human decency," Joy insisted. Eddie leaned forward, each word picking up momentum. "Is it human decency to spring a trap on a guest? To flatten someone's entire career into a list of talking points? To demand apologies for art created in a completely different era?" Joy's face reddened, her voice trembling as the moment spiraled out of her control. "I'm not going to be lectured by someone who built a career on offensive material. And I'm not going to sit here quietly while you pretend I walked into a fair conversation," Eddie snapped. "Did you truly believe I'd just nod along while you tried to compress 40 years of work into a single negative narrative?" The tension reached a fever pitch. The panel looked terrified, the audience frozen as if carved from stone. It felt less like a talk show and more like a fault line splitting apart in front of millions. Joy tried to regain footing. "This is exactly the hostility I'm talking about," she said, attempting to reclaim higher ground, even as it collapsed beneath her feet. "Hostility?" Eddie's laugh was sharp and cold. "Joy, you've spent the last 10 minutes tearing into me, my work, and my character. And you call me hostile for defending myself? That's astonishing." Whoopi made another attempt to salvage the wreckage. "Everyone, let's breathe. We're here to have a meaningful discussion." But Eddie had reached the point of no return. This wasn't spirited debate anymore. This was a full-on attack disguised as commentary, and he was done absorbing the blows. The gloves weren't just off. They were on the floor, forgotten, as the confrontation barreled past every limit daytime television was built to maintain. Joy Behar was about to discover, right in front of a nationwide audience, that she had chosen the wrong legend to challenge so aggressively. Eddie rose slowly from his seat, every movement controlled, almost eerily calm. But his eyes told a different story. There was a fire there, one that made the entire studio hold its breath. The shift was immediate. The tension that had hovered earlier transformed into a sudden, unmistakable alarm as one of Hollywood's most enduring icons finally reached his limit. "You know something, Joy?" Eddie's voice dropped into a quiet, dangerous rumble. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The low, steady tone carried far more force than any shouting ever could. "I've been in this industry for over 4 decades. I've dealt with critics, I've handled detractors, and I've survived people rooting for me to fail. But never, not once, have I seen someone invite me on their show only to spring a trap this blatant. Joy shifted uncomfortably, the first flicker of real fear crossing her expression. Eddie, I think you're overreacting to a few simple questions. Simple questions? Eddie's voice cracked across the stage like a whip, causing even the cameramen to tense. You call systematically tearing apart my career simple questions? You call demanding an apology for making people laugh simple questions? Lady, you wouldn't recognize a simple question if it walked up and introduced itself. Behind the cameras, producers panicked, waving frantically for a commercial cut. But the moment had become too big, too volatile, too unstoppable for anyone to contain. I was trying to start a meaningful conversation about accountability, Joy whispered, her earlier confidence evaporating. Meaningful conversation? Eddie laughed, sharp, humorless. Joy, you wouldn't know a meaningful conversation if the instructions were printed on the cue cards. What you wanted was an easy target. You expected me to sit here and let you score points at my expense. Whoopi rose from her seat, aware that the situation had blown past normal daytime turbulence. Eddie, maybe we all need to just breathe for a second. No, Whoopi, he shot back, his voice still steady but burning hot. I'm done with the breathing exercises. I'm done pretending this kind of ambush is normal. I'm tired of watching conversations get hijacked by lectures and moral grandstanding instead of genuine dialogue. He turned back to Joy, whose entire demeanor had shifted from bold critic to cornered onlooker. You want to talk about harm? Eddie continued. You've turned what should have been a celebration of art into a hostile interrogation. You've shown everyone watching that open conversation is impossible when someone walks in with a preloaded agenda. Joy protested weakly. I never meant to tear you down. Oh, really? Eddie asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. Then what exactly do you call spending 15 minutes picking apart my character, my work, and my integrity? A friendly chat? A lighthearted catch-up? If this wasn't an attempted takedown, I'd genuinely love to hear your definition of one. Sarah Haynes made a final attempt at peace. Maybe there was just a miscommunication. There was no miscommunication, Sarah. Eddie cut in, softening only toward her. Then, turning back to Joy, his tone hardened again. This wasn't an accident. Joy knew exactly where she wanted this to go. The only thing she miscalculated was assuming I'd sit quietly and let it happen. Joy, scrambling for control she no longer had, forced out one last retort. Eddie, I think you're being paranoid. The studio fell silent. Everyone knew that was the wrong thing to say. And right there, on live national television, Joy Behar was about to discover she had chosen the absolute worst moment and the absolute wrong legend to publicly provoke. Eddie slowly stood up from his chair, each movement calm, controlled, but radiating a heat that instantly changed the entire mood of the studio. What had moments earlier been tense now snapped into outright danger. The air felt charged, electric, because one of Hollywood's most beloved giants had officially reached his limit. But no one was prepared for what he said next. You know something, Joy? Eddie began, his voice dropping into a low, thunderous murmur, far more frightening than any shouting. For over 4 decades, I've survived critics, haters, and people praying I'd fail, but never, not once have I walked onto a stage and been blindsided by a sanctimonious setup like this. Joy shifted uncomfortably, a flicker of real fear crossing her face as she realized she had just awakened something she never intended to face. Eddie, you're reading way too much into a few simple questions, she stammered. But that was the wrong button to push. Simple questions? Eddie exploded, his voice cracking through the studio like a blast of dynamite. Several crew members actually recoiled. You call tearing down 40 years of my work simple questions? You call demanding I apologize for making millions laugh simple questions? Joy, you wouldn't recognize a simple question if it wore a name tag. Producers behind the cameras were frantically signaling for a commercial break. But the confrontation had already taken on a momentum of its own, a runaway freight train nobody could stop. Joy's voice wavered. I was trying to create a conversation about accountability. A thin attempt, one Eddie immediately ripped apart. Conversation? Joy, you wouldn't know an honest dialogue if it came with instructions, he shot back. You ambushed me. You wanted an easy target, someone who'd sit here and take your shot so you could score a few self-righteous points. Whoopi Goldberg rose from her seat, eyes wide, sensing this was spiraling past anything a daytime talk show had ever seen. Eddie, maybe we should all take a moment. No, Whoopi, Eddie snapped, though not unkindly. His energy was focused, sharp, like a blade. I'm done calming down. I'm done pretending this ambush style of journalism is fine. I'm done watching Joy hijack every discussion so she can shame people instead of having a real conversation. He turned back to Joy, who now looked genuinely shaken. You want to talk about harm? Let's talk about what you just did, Eddie said. This should have been a celebration of creativity. Instead, you twisted it into a venomous interrogation. You showed everyone watching that an honest conversation is impossible when one person comes in with a mission to destroy the other. Joy tried again, weakly. I wasn't trying to destroy you. Oh, really? Eddie said, voice laced with ice. Then what do you call attacking my character, my work, and my integrity for 15 straight minutes? What do you call demanding I repent for comedy that brought joy to millions? If that's not a takedown attempt, then please, explain what is. Sarah Haynes made a last attempt to salvage the moment. Maybe there was a miscommunication? There was no miscommunication, Eddie corrected, briefly softening before turning back to Joy. This was intentional. She knew the fire she was trying to light. Her only mistake was thinking I'd sit here and let myself burn. Joy tried one final desperate pivot. Eddie, you're being paranoid. Not everything is an attack on you. And that was the spark that ignited everything. Paranoid? Eddie thundered, the word ripping through the room. You spend nearly 20 minutes tearing apart everything I've built, and I'm paranoid for noticing? Did you think gaslighting me on live TV would work? That I'd question my own reality because you said so? The audience was frozen, breathless. This wasn't a tantrum. This was a titan defending his legacy, his career, his very identity from someone who had wildly underestimated him. This is exactly the problem with people like you, Eddie continued, his voice resonating with decades of survival in a brutal industry. You attack, you provoke, and when the person finally stands up for themselves, you dismiss them as dramatic, paranoid, overreacting. Well, that trick doesn't work on me. Joy had nothing left. She sat motionless, hollow, completely overwhelmed. You know the real tragedy here? Eddie said, now speaking with a heavy, disappointed calm. You had a legend in front of you. A man who spent 40 years studying the craft of comedy, of storytelling, of connection. You could have had a real conversation about the art, but instead you chose to start a political witch hunt, because that's the only move you know. He paused, letting the silence stretch, then looked straight into the camera. And that, he concluded, voice razor sharp, is more offensive than any joke I've ever told. Silence blanketed the studio. Whoopi finally attempted to breathe life back into the moment. Well, that was certainly intense, she said, though even she sounded shaken. Eddie gave the room one last look, anger fading, disappointment lingering. It didn't have to be this way, Whoopi. It really didn't. Then he turned and walked off, leaving behind stunned viewers, speechless hosts, and a completely dismantled Joy Behar, who had just learned what happens when you try to corner a lion. If moments like this captivate you, when legends refuse to bow and flip the script on their critics, make sure you subscribe. And tell us below, what do you think Joy Behar's real motive was for launching such an orchestrated attack on Eddie Murphy's legacy?